Hey everybody, Chad Wesley Smith here for Juggernaut Training Systems. I'm joined by Dr. Mike Israetel of Renaissance Periodization. How you doing, Dr. Mike?
Pretty good, Chad. How are you?
I like our poses that we've got going on here.
No.
So today we want to talk to you about something that's extremely important to the training of a powerlifter, or really any lifter, and seems to be extremely misunderstood. And that is the idea of properly peaking for a meet. So there are a lot of different factors that go into this, and probably beyond the scope of this video, but Dr. Mike is a great authority of knowledge in this, his PhD in sport physiology. So we want to just kind of pick his brain about some ideas that are going to help you guys put your best performances on the platform rather than leaving them in the gym, which I think we could both agree we see way too many people, even very high level lifters, doing. So as you go about designing a peak for your program, what are some of the main factors that need to be considered with that?
Yeah, so just from a very quick theoretical perspective, peaking is measured by a variable called preparedness. Your preparedness to exhibit maximal best performances. Preparedness is a sum of two things added together: your fitness and your fatigue. If you are training super duper hard, then you are going to be really fit. You have big, strong muscles. But because you're training really, really hard, you're also accumulating quite a bit of fatigue. And we've all been in that situation where we're jacked, pumped to the gills. It's awesome. We feel relatively good. But at the same time, knees hurt a little bit. And man, if I just had a couple of rest days, I could really, really perform. So the question of peaking is, how do we keep our fitness elevated and at the same time drop fatigue? And there are a couple of really, really good ways to do that, so that at the end of that process, hopefully on meet day, somewhere around that area, we can have the highest fitness, lowest fatigue, and have the best preparedness possible. You show up like a warrior god to the platform and you become unstoppable. Hopefully the police don't get involved.
I see what you did there. I like the become unstoppable plug.
Oh yeah, there you go.
That wasn't on purpose, was it?
It was completely not on purpose. So you asked what particular variables you want to take into consideration. So generally speaking, there are multiple lengths of what is called a taper that you can do, because you have to taper your volume and intensity to peak, okay? And the lengths of the taper and kind of its design depend on a couple of factors. Probably the most important is how much homeostatic damage can you take as a lifter? How much can you tear your body apart, and how long does it take it to recover? And those generally correlated to one big thing: how much can you total? If you are 2,000 plus raw total, you're probably taking 3 or maybe even 4 weeks of total tapering time, because you can do so much damage with the lifts that it takes you that long for your fatigue to drop. And interestingly, if you have a very well-established base and you're super strong, your fitness tends to hang in for a while, even if you're not training at your maximal volumes and intensity. On the other hand, if you happen to be a person with smaller muscle masses, who's not quite as strong, also perhaps newer to powerlifting, the amount of time that you need to drop off your fatigue is going to be relatively small. Maybe as little as a week in some cases. You don't need to do a 4-week long taper. And so if you're totaling, less than 1,000 raw, you may need between 1 and 2 weeks for a taper. If you're totaling around 1,500, something like 3 weeks is probably a good thing to start dropping your volumes first, then your intensities. And then if you're really super elite, I don't know, Chad Wesley Smith or somebody like that from the internet, you may need up to 3, sometimes 4 weeks to make sure your fatigue drops adequately and your fitness is maintained.
So even though I know it's one of our favorite movies, Rocky IV, I think Rocky IV has misled a lot of people into thinking that Rocky is doing a great job of training out there in the Siberian wilderness where Dr. Mike was born. As he's lifting logs and stuff, leading up to the day of his fight with Ivan Drago. But in reality, Rocky is doing the reverse of what we want to do. He's increasing his load as he goes and training his hardest right before the competition, which is of course a mistake, and Mike explained in the fitness fatigue relationship there. So we've talked about fitness fatigue, so preparedness. We've talked about the length of the taper. Anything else that's really important?
Here's a huge one: you have to drop your volumes first, and you can actually keep your intensities relatively high pretty close to the meet. So the biggest mediator of fatigue, the biggest stimulus for fatigue is volume of training. Sets times reps times weight. Basically, in powerlifting terms, how many sets and reps you should be doing, reps of 1 to 3 anyway in your peaking phase. I think that's pretty common knowledge nowadays. You should be training heavy anyway. How many sets you do should start to get cut wherever it is. Let's use an example. What do you think? 1,500 pound total is a good example to use?
Sure.
So if you total around 1,500 raw, about 2 or 3 weeks out.
Let's say like 1,500 is like a 190, 220. So like
exactly
a good but not outstanding total.
Correct. So you should probably start about 2.5 weeks out. You should take your volume of training and cut it in half. The number of sets you do usually, cut those sets in half. Only about a week to a week and a half out should you drop the weight off of the bar down to much lighter weights. So you should drop the weight in this fashion. Of course, you drop the volume in this fashion. The volume drops first. For about a week, you're training really heavy, but just a couple of sets. Keep that intensity there. If you keep the intensity high for longer, it allows you to conserve more fitness. If you drop the weight on the bar 3 or 4 weeks out completely, what's going to end up happening is you're going to show up to the meet, you're going to feel great, but you're going to be weaker because you lost some fitness. So the volume drop really starts to take that fatigue down. Keeping the intensity up just a bit longer keeps that fitness up. Of course, a week out or so for the powerlifter in our example, you're going to take that intensity and you're going to drop it out too. You're going to have a couple of really light workouts that last week. Don't just take the whole last week off. There are some good, you want to stay limber, you want to stay pliable, you want to stay technical, so you still want to practice the lifts. But look, if you squat 500 for a max, 135 for 3 sets of 3 is not going to damage you. It is not going to fatigue you. As a matter of fact, it's going to bring down fatigue even more because it's going to run blood through the area and make all the tissues pliable and things like that. Light workouts leading up for the week, hit the meet, and you're going to do really, really well. So volume first, then intensity, not the other way around. If you're doing, multiple sets of 10 in that last week before, like, oh yeah, got a powerlifting meet, can't train heavy, I bench a 405 at the meet, so I'm just going to do 315 for, 5 sets of 8, get the blood running through. I mean, that's a ton of volume, and it's not going to prevent the fatigue from declining.
Any other factors to consider when designing a proper peak?
Well, know yourself. That's a really good one. You can only, if you have a coach design your peak, you can probably do a really good job if you give him or her the right kind of feedback, especially if you have a coach for more than one meet cycle. So if you know that your deadlift is very resilient compared to others, most people's deadlifts, right? If they pull really heavy too close to the meet, they're going nowhere fast. The deadlift takes a really long time to recover. So if you're one of those people, just particular mechanics or whatever, luck of the draw, if you don't deadlift heavy in 2 weeks, your deadlift goes down, but you could deadlift heavy relatively often and be okay, let your coach know that. Or if you design your own program, don't take your deadlift intensity out really far from the meet just because so-and-so with a huge deadlift on the internet said so. If your deadlift feels sloppy, way too far out, you might want to adjust the program to where it fits best. Generally speaking, another little tidbit here, the deadlift drops fatigue the slowest, the squat is next after that, and the bench is last. So you can bench heavy relatively close to the meet, you can squat heavy so somewhere in the middle, and your last heavy or high volume deadlift days should be pretty far out. That's not the case for everyone, it's just an average. So if you notice that your squat and deadlift are about even, as opposed to deadlift being really, really fatigued, make sure you program it that way. Some people's squat doesn't recover after about 3 weeks. They should squat heavy, and the furthest out from the meet, and they may be able to deadlift heavy a little bit more, depending on personal circumstance. So every single little principle we talk about here, the personal, how you respond to it is very important to tailor.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo that same idea. You have to take ownership of what you're doing. As Dr. Mike was saying, do what's right for you, not what's right for me or for Dr. Mike or Brandon Lilly or whoever it is, just because you read it on the internet. But you have to understand your own training process and feel confident in that. So to do that, and to also that time leading up to the meet, the month of, the week of, the day of, is not the time for new things. All right, that's the time to do things that are very known. Eat foods that you've eaten before. Do exercises that you've done before. Train in a manner that you're used to, because it's not the time to present new stimulus to your body. So peaking well for me is something I personally take a lot of pride in. I would put my ability to carry over well from training to competition against anyone's. And I think you guys can learn a lot about peaking properly for meet in Dr. Mike's and myself and Dr. James Hoffman's upcoming book, Understanding Raw Powerlifting, which will be available at jtsstrength.com. Thank you very much, Dr. Mike.
Thanks.